Hey there, this is Tyler, Total Metal Innovations. Today we're going to do a tutorial video showing the assembly of the Magnitude 205 transfer case. Over here we have a front output, intermediate, rear output and front input, and then the Magnitude. The Magnitude's got a hardware kit, shift forks, front bearing retainer, and adapter. A little hardware kit that's got like rear sight tube, interlocks, and O-ring kit, interlock covers, and then the two main housings. Anyway, we're going to get to that install video so you guys can put this thing together correctly. Okay, the first thing you need to do when assembling this case is decide what you want to do for a vent. We leave you a couple options. One, you can run the stock vent cover fitting here as long as it's clocked properly in your vehicle. The other option we give you is a plug that's an 1/8 inch pipe plug that you can drill and tap this hole to plug it, which then would use our interlock cover for your vent. We have standard like diff cover style vent here, or you could put an optional barb fitting, something of that nature, and go to a catch can. So the next step would be to put the SPEEDO gear back in or convert this to a VSS if that's what you're doing. That would be a separate, type video there. We are coming out with a VSS housing soon, but SPEEDO gear goes back in. The output housing of the SPEEDO's little bung, tighten it up, and we'll go to the next step. Next step would be to install the bearing that goes in the rear output housing here. And there's a bunch of ways, obviously using a press. I'm gonna just use a bearing race driver right here and drive this guy in. And it goes flush with the housing. So that would be the next step, complete. So with the rear output, first thing you do is take one of these rings that has a little tab that goes tab side down. There's a little notch that it catches in here. And then you start stacking these bearings. And I actually pre-grease the bearings in a baggie. It makes it a lot easier to stick on here. And then after you get that first row, there's a ring that looks like this here. They'll stack, and then another row of bearings. And I'll throw those together and get you to the next step. Okay, you can see we have all the bearings on here. There's that ring in between that comes in your rebuild kit. Next step is to install the gear with the shift collar teeth facing downward. And then that's followed by, there's a little pin right here, and this ring. This ring goes facing upwards. The little pin goes in the hole. And then this collar goes on so that it lines up with this little tooth, and the notch lines up with that little pin. Right here, you can kind of see that. There's the pin and the notch. Next step is to install a C-clip. It goes down here into the groove, release it. Make sure it's down all the way. Rear output housing goes on with the bearing. And SPEEDO gear. SPEEDO gear takes a little bit of work to get in there. And you have a complete rear output housing basically. Next step is to install the bearing here. I've already put the C-clip on it. It goes on here. They're a little bit snug, but not too bad. Sometimes they need a couple taps. All right, next step is the seal housing and its gasket. They go on here. Hardware. On this one, I'm not gonna put the seal in right away. We're not quite sure what yoke is going on it, so I might not put that in on this tutorial at all, but otherwise you'd put a seal in here. Pretty simple, straightforward. In this step, I flip the housing over. I set it on a couple blocks, 2x4s, whatever works for you. You can put it in a bench vise. And then the longer pins that come in the rebuild kit go in here. I've already greased them, and they're not that fun to put in, but you can get them in here. You gotta stack them against the outer edge, all the way down in there, and probably gonna need a magnet. You gotta screw with them a little bit. Next is this clip. Once you get all these bearings stacked up in here, and it's easiest to kind of push it down and then just flatten it. Use a screwdriver or something, just kind of evenly drive it down in here. And there's a little ring it'll eventually just snap into. Okay, so I've put the output housing away for the rear, and I've switched over, grabbed the front output shaft, and I use the intermediate gear to help stabilize it in this case. And the same thing here, we're just gonna start stacking these bearings around. It's the little ones, same as the rear used when it was double row, and then a ring, and we'll flip back once I get these all stacked up for you guys. Okay, next step after putting those bearings on and putting the ring between them is to put the gear with the shift collar side down over the bearings, like so. I knocked a couple out, I'll have to put back in here, but I can get those here in a second. You can put them on this side still if it's just the top row, which I got, so. The gear's on the front output shaft. It uses the pin and the big ring. It does not use the small stamped ring. That has the little tab. So we'll put the pin in here, this ring, followed by the snap ring. And that finishes this side of the front output shaft. That is followed up by installing the shift collar, the gear, and washer. And then we're gonna put this shaft aside for a minute here. Next thing we're doing is we're gonna take the two bearing retainers. This is the front bearing retainer that we supply and the rear bearing retainer, and drive their new races in, or bearings. And this bearing goes in here. See, and this bearing needs to go down below the lip a little bit, so I have a race driver that's a little smaller. Finish it off. And then the C-clip that we provide, or internal clip, is gonna go in here next, and I'm gonna install it and we'll get back to you. So here's the C-clip that goes on the inside here, and there's a little groove that we machined. It's a little different than the way the factory one is. So you can see here, we put this ring in. This holds that bearing in as opposed to holding it from the front like the factory. Next, we're gonna get the idler gear set up with the new bearing races. Drive them in on both sides. Once those are in, we're gonna grab the case and get to the next step. So in this step, we're gonna have the front case half. We supply a little plate here that you're gonna use in the next step. You're gonna need a mag base and indicator and a set of calipers to set up the intermediate gear properly. We're gonna have a couple of links on our website to like some inexpensive ones, and then maybe a couple of higher end ones of these if you wanted to get something quality. Most people have some calipers. If not, maybe your buddy does. But I'll kind of get this set up and we'll show you how we're gonna do it here. So what I have now is the front half of the case up on a couple of blocks with some towels protecting it. And we're gonna take one of the idler gear bearings, place it in there, the spacer and gear. The gear goes big side down in this case. And if you're reusing gears out of a 205, you're already gonna have a shim stack. What you need to do with it is add 3 or 4 or 5 of them out of our shim pack. We're trying to get it too thick to start with. If you're starting with all new gears, then you probably just put our whole pack that we send in or send out with you guys, and it'll go on next with the bearing. And then the idler shaft gear, or idler shaft's gonna go down through all of this. And you're gonna drive it down with like a dead blow. And I'm gonna grab one real quick, I'm gonna drive it down, and I'm gonna show you our torque specs on the other side, and then how to get the measurements here. Hammer this down. I only need to hammer it in far enough that this bottom where the shaft comes out, the threads are at least as long as the nut that goes on that side. You can also use a press. In fact, I'd prefer it. I'm just trying to show like how most people would do it here. So we're just gonna hammer this in. After you either press or drive the intermediate shaft in far enough, you need to get the nut completely engaged by the threads. You end up torquing it to 130 foot-pounds, and then we're gonna flip this case over, back vertical. We're going to lightly bolt down this plate to these 2 holes here, or on this side, doesn't matter. I send this plate along, and its intent is to mount your mag base to. Can't hook to the aluminum case otherwise. These just need to be snug. And what you're gonna do here, and this step, I can't emphasize enough, is probably the most important thing of installing this whole case, is following this little procedure here. And maybe I should have said that at the beginning, but I wanna emphasize that this part is really important. This is where you're setting the bearing preload. So you're gonna take your mag base and set it on this plate. And I'm gonna kinda set it so you guys can kinda see this, and maybe I can get camera zoomed in here even. So what you want to do is with the gear all the way down, you're going to need to turn this to 0. Some of the bases have like an adjustment screw, but anyway, get it to 0 or write the number down. And then since we put too many shims in, it's going to be loose. It's going to be able to do this. So what we need to do is pull up firm, and you need to record that number, and the difference between those is what you need to pull out of shims. So basically, just to say it again, once that's bolted down, get this mag base set up. You're gonna set it up so that the shaft of it is vertical, and measure the distance between down by zeroing it and up. We're gonna now take this back apart. I'll pull it apart, and once it's apart, I'll show you our next step. So I got the nut off, and I wanted to actually put a note in here real quick. This shaft has got really fine threads on it, and I've actually damaged a couple of them when we were prototyping these cases. You need to be careful driving the shaft out. It's best to use a press, which is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna go do it off camera real quick because our press is in a location that's kind of hard to video. The other thing is, you know, you could put something here to protect it, a piece of aluminum or a punch that fits just inside the recess here, but take extra care not to damage the threads here. So I've got my shim stack out now after pushing that back apart, and you can see here, at least I hope you can, my stack right now reads 107 thousandths. And when I measured this one in particular, it needed 46 thousandths taken out of it. You're trying to get it so that the bearings have basically 0 preload on them, but if anything, I want to err on the side of taking like just a couple thousandths more out than the 46. You don't want it loose, but we're not trying to get preload here. So in this case, I'm gonna get 46 thousandths out of this and start reassembling it, and I'll check back with you here in a second. So with my 107 and needing to subtract the 46, which your guys' numbers will be different, I needed 61 thousandths left. And now I have 60, which is just a teeny bit under it, and I'd rather that than a little over. So I'm gonna take this and reassemble it and retest it. So we got it reassembled after we took the number of shims out of our shim stack that we were reading here, and retorqued down to 130 foot-pounds. And I don't know if you can see in the video. If not, I apologize, and I'll check this out and do it again. But you can see that I still have, I don't know, about 1/4 thou of play, which I need to take out also. So the basically comes back apart, do it again, take 1/4 thou more out. So I measured the shims. I had a bunch of 9s and a 12.5 in there. So I actually had to swap out. I took a 9 out and I added a smaller shim. So remember, in our shim packs that we send out, we have a couple of really thin ones. So you might have to take something out and put another one back in. But now if you look, it's got 0 preload on it. It's not tight, like with a bunch of preload, but it's not loose either. So we're trying to get basically 0. Okay, off camera, I pressed the bearing in onto the input shaft and put the C-clip on. It's pretty straightforward, so I figured you guys can handle that. Make sure you put the snap ring groove towards the input shaft of the gear. And then in this case is gonna be passenger drop, which it can be either or, but this particular one's passenger. So I'm gonna shove the input shaft in the driver's side here. Just kind of move the gears together and push her in there. And get my dead blow, give it a couple. Okay, at this point, the bearing is all the way through, far enough to get the snap ring on. Install the snap ring, and then drive this back into the case. And then we will be installing the front bearing retainer. Front bearing retainer gets an O-ring that comes in our kit here. It helps to put a little bit of grease on that. I'm gonna go grab some grease and come back to this. So I got the O-ring installed in the back of the front bearing retainer. Just added a little bit of grease to hold it. It'll go, on this case, since it's passenger drop over here, and you just have to rotate it till you find a set of the holes that line up and push her in. And then it's assembled with these 6 socket head cap screws here, where you need to put anti-seize on them into the aluminum, and they're gonna get torqued to 22 foot-pounds. Next, we're gonna tap in the 2 shift rail seals, the bearing driver, the race driver. One thing I forgot to mention, some transfer cases will have a bearing retainer here. This application is gonna go against an adapter that has the retainer built into it, so we're not gonna put this one on there. That's why I didn't earlier, forgot to mention that. But I'm gonna flip the case over and pretty much the rest of it's from the other side. Okay, after you have the side we just completed there done, you need to get the shift fork that goes on the passenger side, and you can tell the shift fork for the passenger side is the one that has the flat that goes all the way to the back, where the driver's one stops a little bit short here. And it needs to go on the fork as you slide the front output in. Line this up a little bit, drop her in. Yep. Next, you'll be taking the the driver's side shift fork, putting it together. This is the one with the notch not going to the end opposite, and sliding it down in here, like that. And then you'll be following up by installing the gasket. The gasket is basically a rope of O-ring material, and you're gonna want to put the seam right at the top with just a tiny little dowel of black RTV or gray RTV. It's just gonna go around here, and I'll get that done. So I got the O-ring around it. It's a little long, we send a little bit long. Had to cut it to length, put a little tiny dab of RTV there, and it's time to start assembling the rear case half. It's slides on. And then you're going to take the supplied bolts. They go around. I'll flip it around here in a second after I get a couple of them in, but there's 2 holes that don't get these, and I'll show you those in the next step here. So I just got a couple of the bolts. I'm going to put them on the outside of the case, just not in the center hole on the 2 sides. That's going to be basically a fake bolt that's going to be used as a jack screw to pull this apart if you ever need to service it. So put it in 2 of them, cross from each other, and use those 2 to pull the case back together to meet up with each other. And once you're done with that, all the other bolts can go in around the case half except for these 2 that are here that are going to be the jack shaft bolts, and get torqued to 22 foot-pounds. Okay, I just wanted to point out one more time that there's 2 short bolts. They go in this hole and this hole. They're threaded, and it's pushes on the dowel pin. So if you ever need to pull the case apart, you pull all these bolts out, and any 2 of these bolts go in there. They're enough longer that they hit that dowel pin and will push this case back apart for you. But these just go in here. Next, we'll be putting the rear of the front output shaft on with its gasket. Gasket goes there. The little teardrop piece faces up kind of at, I don't know, 1130, 1145. Goes on here. And this uses these studs. You'll be never seizing the studs into the case, torquing them to 22 foot-pounds. And then it has washers and lock nuts that are going to go on the back here, and they get torqued to 22 foot-pounds. Okay, one of the things on the rear output, which we're about ready to stick in here, is there's a little flange right here that's an oil catch. In some applications, more often when it's driver's drop, you need to trim this slightly at about a 45-degree angle so that it misses the idler shaft gear. It would be kind of in this direction if that was the case. On this case, it doesn't hit, so I'm just gonna assemble it. Same thing, the 8 bolts around here get installed, or 8 studs get installed with never seize on them, torqued to 22 foot-pounds with the Allens, and then the bolts or the nuts get 22 foot-pounds as well. Next, you're going to take the 2 fittings that hold the sight tube, and they go on the inner 2 holes here. Either some thread sealant or some Teflon tape on those, thread them in, and then the tube gets put on pretty simply here. You unthread this, slide this over the tube, press it on there, and then snug it back up. So I got the one side installed already, and then I stuck the tube nut on this one, and you'll cut it just a teeny bit longer than where it goes to the flange of that fitting. Slip it on like that, slide the tube nut up, tighten it, and your sight tube's full, or sorry, installed. I was actually thinking, what I use for a good sight tube reference is the bottom of this little teardrop that covers your idler shaft. Just at that line is about where the oil level needs to be in this case. So pretty much the last thing on this side of the case, because we're leaving the yokes and seals off of this one because we don't have the yoke for it yet, is the fill and drain plug. They're in here, pretty self-explanatory. I got a little bit of Teflon tape on them, and we'll snug them up. I'm gonna flip the case around here next, and I'm gonna show you a couple little things on the back that you can't quite see on this side, and then we'll finish up the top. So another thing I was gonna show you again, and I just mentioned it, is the oil level needs to be right at the bottom of this teardrop here. That's where we normally run it. Doesn't even matter the rotation of the transfer case, it runs about there. If you're running the vent off of the stock deal, it could end up in a couple different angles depending on if you're using the housing off of a Dodge, Ford, or GMC. And same if you're using a stock housing, same with the SPEEDO here, it could be rotated in a couple different directions. So if you were having some problems with this, you could try a housing off of something else to get a different clocking angle. That pretty much wraps up that. The next thing we're gonna do is grab the interlocks and interlock housings. The interlock pins drop right in here. Be careful not to drop them in the case at this point. You could probably get them out by tipping it over, but they just sit in this little groove right here. And the two interlocks have an O-ring groove on them right here, which is the last two O-rings that we've provided go on here and here. And the one with 3 holes on each side goes towards the front of the vehicle if you're a front engine vehicle, so towards the shift rails. And that's where your detents are gonna go eventually. So they go on this side, it sits in there. The other one goes in the back and would either have the 1/8 inch pipe plug that we provide, or the vent, or an elbow, whatever fitting you want to go to a remote oil cooler, or sorry, not oil cooler, but reservoir. And these little bolts hold them in. They do not get torqued very tight. They do not have much threads in the case due to the holes being blind right above the shifters. A little bit of never sees and just snug these up. Now that the case is pretty much assembled, I was going to point out a little bit of information about these bolt holes on the front. There's 2 groups of 3 that are mirrored from side to side. So you should get 0, -7, or -14 degrees of rotation with a standard adapter. There might be some exclusions to that, but there's basically 3 on each side that would work with most any adapter, giving you a lot of options there. That's what the studs that are remaining, washers and nylock nuts are for. But that pretty much concludes our assembly video here. And if you have any questions, feel free to get a hold of us at magnitude@totalmetalinnovations.com.